I'm a professor of economic sociology at the faculty. Jointly with Andreas Novi, Vienna University of Economics and Business, and Carsten Schneider, Central European University, I have initiated this visiting professorship. We are grateful to the Austrian Chamber of Labor in Vienna and the city of Vienna for their generous funding and support. Apart from fostering the academic debate building upon Karl Polanyis' work in a contemporary perspective, this program also aims at supporting interdisciplinary cooperation among the three universities in Vienna, where sociology, political science, and economics are thriving. My thanks also extend to the Viennese community colleges, the Wiener Volkshochschulen, which have a great tradition, both as a transfer institution of academic debate to the interested wider public, and as a shelter for scholars who, notably between the two world wars, did not conform to the common sense at the university because of their critical thinking. Thank you for having become host of the public lecture series of the Viennese Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship. After Nancy Fraser, whom we have invited in the spring term of this year, we can now proudly present one of the best scholars to guide us into Karl Polany's thoughts, Fred Block. He's not only one of the leading scholars in political and economic sociology, but also one of the most eminent specialists in the work of Karl Polanyi. Based at the University of California in Davis is he. I want to mention just three of Fred Block's many major contributions to academia. First of all, he has done us a great service by producing a single edition of Karl Polany's many versions of The Great Transformation. Then I would like to mention a book that he has co-authored with Margaret Summers, The Power of Market Fundamentalism, Karl Polany's Critique, where he discusses the rise of free market ideology after the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II. And last but not least, I would like to alert you to his most recent book, Capitalism, The Future of an Illusion, which has been published by the University of California Press in 2018, which is a meticulous examination of the assumptions guiding the ideology that underlies important streams in economic thought that became the dominant principles in the organization of society, and that at least contributes to many of the societal problems that we are nowadays confronted with. It is this concern that will be at the focus of today's public lecture. Why are liberal democracies in crisis? Fred Block, thank you very much to share your thoughts with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bernard, for that introduction. I greatly appreciate it. So let me start by expressing both my deep regret that I cannot be there with you in Vienna, and my gratitude for the invitation, and my thanks to the colleagues at the International Karl Polanyis Society, particularly Andreas Novi and Brigitte, who are doing an exemplary job of linking scholarly work to public debates. I also obviously need to thank Bernard for being an untiring and generous host for this remote visit. I also want to start by acknowledging that by some coincidence, we're meeting today on the 103rd anniversary of the armistice that ended the Great War, World War I, a catastrophic war that occupied a central role in the life story and in the intellectual output of Karl Polanyi. The war effectively brought to a close his time in Budapest, and of course, brought him to Vienna, whose conflicting intellectual currents would decisively shape his thinking. So let me say at the outset that I conceive this talk and Monday's talk in Linz as two parts of one story. But I have to warn you that today's talk is fairly dark. It's about the severity of the crisis of democracy that we're currently experiencing. Monday's talk will be sunnier. It will suggest a possible way out of the current crisis. So please don't succumb to despair over the weekend. Come back on Monday and I will try to undo the damage. So my topic is really the disturbing parallels between the rise of authoritarianism in the 1930s and our current situation. And obviously, I draw on Karl Polanyis' work to make sense of these parallels. So let me say at the outset that I'm not by nature a prophet of doom. On the contrary, when we were working on our book together, we labeled my co-author Margaret Summers as Cassandra, and I was Pollyanna. For those of you who don't know, she's the heroine of a series of American children's books from the early 20th century who was known for her unfailing optimism. However, the seriousness of the threat to liberal democracy in the US and globally cannot be exaggerated. So my starting point is that Donald Trump's effort in January of this year to overturn the results of the presidential election came very close to success. And even in the aftermath of that, a number of Republican state legislatures have essentially passed legislation that allows them to overturn the results of an election in their state. Perhaps one of the most disturbing things is that Viktor Orban's model of illiberal democracy in Hungary has become a model for key figures in the Republican Party. Various right-wing US leaders are making pilgrimages to Budapest to learn at Orban's feet. He's providing them a blueprint for maintaining power without majority support. So essentially what I'm saying is that if Donald Trump, or even more dangerously, a more skillful right-wing authoritarian were to capture the US presidency in 2024, which is a very real prospect, we would see a more explicit authoritarian international linking that president with Putin, Orban, Xi, Erdogan. And such a powerful authoritarian international would make the defense of democracy within the rest of Europe much more difficult. So even though I'm focusing on the US, what I say has profound implications across Europe and across the world. And we should have no illusions about the ability of popular mobilization to dislodge authoritarian leaders in the short term. After all, it took 40 years of effective authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe before the resistance was able to finally triumph. And now we have the new surveillance strategies such as Pegasus spyware and control of the internet that create even deeper obstacles for effective resistance strategy. At its core, we can understand the crisis of democracy as fundamentally about polarization, the weakening of centrist parties and politicians, and the strengthening of forces on the left and on the right, and outside of the ordinary political spectrum, like Italy's five-star movement. So what I'm presenting is an anatomy of polarization, an explanation of how and why it happens. It seems both now and in the 1930s, the precipitating event was public disillusionment with centrist political leaders. This happened quite fast in the 1930s as the global economy collapsed and economic dislocation was quite general. It happened more slowly over the last 2 or 3 decades. And I would stress that in both these cases, in a Polanysian mode, that this disillusionment is both material and cultural. It's that the center can no longer deliver the goods, and it can no longer be trusted to maintain stability, order, and predictability. In the more recent period, the disillusionment, from my perspective, is a response to the extended rule of austerity that kept governments from being responsive to people's needs. This period of austerity goes back to the 1990s, or even in the US case, even earlier. The period from World War II through the 1970s was a period of expansion and increased social spending. Since 1990, we've had a period of retrenchment across all of the developed market economies. Just one small indicator of this is that if you look at the amount that the OECD reports that countries spend on unemployment insurance, one of the protective mechanisms that insulates people from the power of the market. In Austria, for example, this peaked at 1.6% of GDP in 1991. In 27, it had fallen to 0.6% of GDP. The same pattern is general across countries. But beyond cutbacks, austerity has also meant that most of these countries were unable to provide some of the key things that parts of the population wanted. High on the list is affordable housing. We know that across these countries, there's a crisis of housing affordability as social housing has given way to mortgage-backed housing purchases. The reduction in working hours that had been going on for many years came to a halt in the austerity period. Governments refused to increase their spending for environmental protection to deal with the impending climate crisis. And most importantly, they were unable to do anything about growing income inequality. Across the OECD countries, income inequality is at its highest level of the past half century. The average income of the richest 10% of the population is about 9 times that of the poorest 10% across the OECD, up from 7 times in 25 years ago. The situation in the US, of course, is much worse. I'm going to read a passage from a forthcoming book by a Canadian colleague, Tom Mallison, that kind of uses a stunning image to explain the extent of income inequality. And I should note that wealth inequality is even much more horrible than income inequality. So he writes, wrapping one's head around the scale of this inequality can be a difficult thing to do. One useful illustration is that of the income parade. Imagine that you're on the sidewalk watching a giant parade. Over the course of 1 hour, the entire society, this is the entire US society, will walk by, starting from the poorest and ending with the richest. Imagine also that each person's height is proportional to their income. The richer one is, the taller. So the median person in the very middle of the parade with a median income of $33,700 will also be the median height, 5'6". Now imagine that you're standing at the side of the parade. For the first 20 minutes, you would see only wave after wave of little people, all less than 3'5". Not only is everyone very short, but at this stage, the parade is dreadfully monotonous. Every minute goes by, people are barely getting taller. After 30 minutes, the parade is halfway done and people are still only 5'6". And still things remain quite boring. After 40 minutes, the people are finally over 8 feet tall. And by 50 minutes, they're 12 feet tall. At the very end of the parade, the giants appear. At 59 minutes and 24 seconds, we see the top 1% who are 85 feet tall. And now with every instant that passes, they're growing exponentially taller. In the last few microseconds, we see the richest 1,000th of 1%. They are 2 miles tall. Finally, Jeff Bezos is an astonishing 247 miles tall. His head touches the International Space Station. You can understand why these super billionaires are so interested in entering outer space because of the analogy. Now, Tom wrote this, I guess, a year ago, and I think Elon Musk has now passed Jeff Bezos as the richest person on the planet. And so presumably he would be even more than 247 miles tall. So why did this period of austerity last so long? We know that at the level of ideas and beliefs, it's been the return of the same market fundamentalist ideas that Karl Polanyis challenged. And this goes back to the rise of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who enthusiastically embraced the free market ideas of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. But we also have to recognize that by the time we get to the 1990s, we have the phenomenon of left neoliberalism, figures like Gerhard Schroeder, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, and many others coming from traditionally left parties who embrace the sovereignty of the market and the related policies. At the level of institutions, the blame lies with the increasingly market-centered organization of the global economy since the 1973 shift from fixed exchange rates to floating exchange rate. That shift and the resulting dramatic expansion in global capital mobility and the exponential growth of markets for derivatives, exchange rate futures, interest rate futures, credit default swaps, effectively recreated the deflationary bias of the 19th century gold standard. After all, it was in response to these pressures that Europe agreed to the debt limitations of the Maastricht Treaty that effectively locked in the austerity, since each country had to both limit its debt and was under pressure to lower taxes on corporations and high-income individuals. But I want to stress here that the disillusionment with centrist politicians and the status quo is both material and cultural. Yes, there's significant parts of the population that experience material hardship, but what other people experience in these sometimes is a loss of status relative to other groups, minorities, immigrants, women. I think the metaphor that the Berkeley sociologist Arlie Hochschild came up with in her study of extremely right-wing people in Louisiana is relevant. She envisioned them seeing a long line of people stretching towards the horizon, slowly wending their way forward. But they could also see people cutting into the line, minorities, immigrants, spotted owl, endangered environmental species, and that it was the act of the cutting in, of their being displaced, pushed back in the ordering, that was most infuriating to them. In other words, it wasn't just material goods, but recognition that that was going to these other groups, status that was according to these other groups, rather than to them. So this is Polanyi emphasizes to us that the necessity of linking material and cultural phenomenon, but he also points out that when these combination of material and cultural shocks occur, people seek protection from them. This is the source of the protective counter movement that looms so large in the Great Transformation. But he also emphasized that there are always two strategies of protection, and one strategy we can call a strategy of exclusion, where one unites with people with whom one shares ethnicity, religion, political ideology, against outsiders, against the people who aren't like you. And obviously we see this around the world in various forms of religious fundamentalism, and in the authoritarian movements such as Trump that target immigrants and others. So the exclusionary strategy is one, and obviously the other is an inclusionary strategy that tries to unite the many against the few being the rich, the people who are dominating economic and political power. This was, of course, the strategy of historical movements of the left. We saw it most recently in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which with the slogan, "We are the 99%," essentially uniting the many against the 1% who were perceived as hoarding the resources. Now, the kind of Polanyian insight here is that people can be responding to the same precipitating circumstances, material deprivation, loss of status, loss of a sense that the people in charge know what they're doing, but that the conflicting strategies of response produce extreme polarization, creating ultimately an epistemic divide. So we have to ask the question of why, both in the 30s and today, is this polarization so ferocious when, it could be neighbor against neighbor, people living across the street, responding to the same material and cultural circumstances, but essentially respond in diametrically opposite ways. So part of the answer to why they polarize is the incompatibility of the strategies of protection, that when you're uniting the many against the few, the logical strategy is to transfer resources from the rich to everyone else. When you're pursuing the exclusionary strategy, the idea is to victimize one or another outgroup, expropriate their resources, or just scapegoat them, as with Trump separating children from their parents at the border. It's very hard to combine these strategies, to say we'll take some stuff from the rich and we'll victimize these people over here. There's no kind of middle, or it's very difficult to forge a middle path that's a compromise between them. But the deeper logic of polarization is something that Polanyi emphasized in his analysis of fascism. And I'm going to bracket the whole, is it appropriate to call our contemporary authoritarian enemies fascist or not? I think that that's a side issue. It doesn't really matter what we call them. What matters is the analysis of the logics and dynamics of these right-wing movements. His key argument is that the political leaders pursuing the exclusionary strategy see a great advantage in attacking liberal democracy itself. And that was true then, and it's true now. I mean, we see it with Orban explicitly embracing illiberal democracy. And his explanation of this was that for fascists, the principal enemy were socialists and communists. I mean, that they were the imminent threat against which fascist movements were mobilizing. But that the fascist leaders understood that liberalism's assertion of the equality and dignity of all people was part of what was legitimating the demands of the socialists and the communists. If everybody is equal and endowed with rights, then redistribution makes sense. Liberalism does not provide a sufficient defense against the logic of redistribution. So the fascist response was to negate liberalism, to deny the equality and dignity of all people. And that in turn means negating democracy, since one person, one vote doesn't make sense if people are not equal, if they do not have equal dignity. So whatever we call our contemporary authoritarians of the right, they follow exactly the same logic that Polanyi indicated. They attack liberalism and democratic institutions directly because they see it as necessary to defeat the project of socialism, social democracy, the left. So once this polarized divide exists, it's then, of course, reinforced because the two groups live in separate epistemic communities. That danger of epistemic separation has always been there, but it obviously grew more acute in the 20th century with mass media. The link between fascism and radio was very strong. In our own day, that these movements have been greatly strengthened by the internet and the rise of social media. We saw this particularly in the US with the rapid spread of the QAnon conspiracy theory that insists, among other things, that the leaders of the Democratic Party are pedophiles determined to continue their abuse of children. Now, here I want to talk a little bit about our tendency to underestimate the power of these polarized belief systems. But it's here that the pandemic has made it clear how deep this polarization has become. And, I'm using the US as an example here, but I understand that we're seeing much the same dynamic in Switzerland, Germany, Austria, where the far right has become strongly linked to vaccine resistance, to COVID denial, in very parallel ways to what's happened in the US. Since COVID first hit when Trump was in power, the responses to the pandemic were quickly made part of the polarized political divide. Those loyal to Trump defied mask wearing. They defined it as useless and even harmful. Several governors, Texas and Florida, have issued orders that public schools cannot mandate mask wearing for children, even though they've not been eligible for vaccination. And then once mass vaccination began under Biden, Trump supporters have overwhelmingly rejected the vaccine. Right-wing media and social media sites have been pushing an alternative medical strategy using a medication called ivermectin that's used to fight parasitical worms, has not been shown to be effective against COVID, but it's being widely embraced. Now, it's easy to think that fringe beliefs, crazy ideas, untested medical ideas would be dismissed when people are thinking about issues of life and death. When you're dealing with a virus that routinely kills people. But here, it's easy to forget how much our views are shaped by our culture, a point that Polanyi was quite insistent on throughout his work. So, for example, we know that there are cultures in which the nutrition provided to pregnant women is destructively limited because of deeply inherited food taboos that have survived for many generations. And here we can go back to Max Weber. Part of his reason for invoking the importance of charismatic authority was that people are so deeply immersed in their cultural beliefs that when smoke starts coming out of the nearby mountain, the normal thing to do is to say, oh, don't worry about that smoke. God will protect us. And it requires the charismatic leader who says, you know, it is written that we should always live in this place from now until eternity. But I saith unto you, please follow me. We're going to move 100 miles down the road to get away from this volcano, which is about to kill us all. And even when that charismatic leader emerges, some of those people in that community are going to stay there and say that person doesn't know what he's talking about, that, you know, that we're never going to be hurt by our beloved smoking mountain here. That obviously once this polarization has happened, the dangers it creates are twofold. First, once the center fails within the political system, that we're likely to experience paralysis. That, you know, we saw this with the Obama administration after the triumph of the Tea Party and the Republicans took control of the legislature in 2010. And so then the inability of governments to take effective action further increases the polarization and the threat that authoritarians such as Trump would come to power and begin to undermine democratic institutions and practices. So in the US, unless the Biden administration is able in the next year or two to significantly change the facts on the ground, we live in fear that a Republican will be elected in 2024, and that in some sense, Trump is not even the greatest danger. The greatest danger is another right-wing politician who essentially has much greater self-discipline, much greater political skill than Trump did, and begins taking an aggressively authoritarian turn from the first day in office. So obviously, the polarization that I've described is made even worse by the impending climate crisis, and obviously there's a feedback loop that the efforts to respond to the climate crisis are likely to be resisted by the right, further intensifying, and then the climate consequences, the fires, the hurricanes, the floods, the rising waters, create in the population a deeper sense of dread, of instability, that has the consequence of further deepening the anxiety, the need for protection, and that further feeds the polarization. And obviously, the same thing can be said of the pandemic, that it's not accidental that we've seen the pandemic feeding into this deeper polarization that I've been talking about. So what I'm going to try to do in the talk on Monday is suggest ideas about a way forward in which we can begin to rebuild our democracies, strengthen the links between politics and the center and people where they actually live, spread out across cities, suburbs, small towns, rural areas, because essentially, I don't see any simple and direct path within our established arrangements that's going to provide an escape from the kind of polarization that I've described. So mercifully, I got through these many pages faster than I thought, so we'll have somewhat more time for conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. This has been a somewhat disconcerting message, but we're looking forward to what you will tell us on Monday. And I hope that by then we can look somewhat more optimistically into the future. Now, we have some time left for some questions and answers. And I would like to encourage you to send us whatever your thoughts are. So we will briefly wait for some comments from questions from your side. And perhaps while you are typing in questions, let me perhaps start the discussion with some thoughts that I try to formulate in terms of a question. Oh yes, Stefan Jaks, who is standing behind me, tells me that I should alert you to use the F and A button in order to enter questions and comments. You can find that on the bottom of the screen of the Zoom webinar. What I was intrigued with in your talk is your differentiation into actually two dimensions, or that materialize in form of two groups of people, two sorts of responses to the challenges. On the one hand, an inclusive type of solidarity where people assemble against the rich. I think that was the formulation that you used. On the other side, an exclusive solidarity, which is directed against minorities that receive presumably more recognition. The question is, why do people move into one or the other group? There must be some individual disposition, a set of attitudes that are quite foundational, that lead people to perceive problems in a certain way and to see certain, see themselves faced with certain problems. I will finish my question and then add the first question that has been entered. In the framework of the study that I'm currently directing on the COVID crisis and societal responses, the Austrian Corona panel, we repeatedly find that people differ quite much in terms of education, age, and income, whether they are perceptive to that kind of fake news, myth, and so perhaps to frame it as a question, what do you think, why people respond in the one or the other way?
Okay, no, that's an important and excellent question. And I think that we can kind of make a distinction between some broad categories, and we can come up with some fairly strong correlations. But kind of, I'd want to stress that when we get down to the level of the individual, it's pretty much unpredictable. And so we saw this very clearly with the QAnon phenomenon, which was obviously very closely linked to social media and Facebook in particular. And essentially the idea that we've all learned at this point is that the algorithms on Facebook are designed to keep you engaged and involved. And so you enter in, some search term, and then it starts giving you progressively more and more extreme versions of whatever it is that you started with. And we saw anecdotal evidence of lots of people who would have normally be aligned with the left, with progressives in the US, essentially following that down into the rabbit hole and ending up in extreme QAnon beliefs. And so there was a very powerful kind of unpredictable character of that, which I think does kind of come back to the point that I was making, that the sense of personal unease that is precisely what motivates people to seek protection is open in terms of its political valence. I mean, that it means that you're looking for some story that will provide reassurance to deal with that unease. And so idiosyncrasies of personality are going, but obviously, in a broader sense, we could say that yes, that demographically, people with lower levels of education are more likely to be drawn to these authoritarian movements of the right. That in terms of ethnicity, the appeal to whiteness around the world is very strong, and I think age is pretty complicated, but it's the nexus between age and education, and so the more educated young people are more likely to turn to the left, and the less educated young people more to the right. So,
okay, thank you very much. In the meantime, quite a few questions came in, and so I want to give people who are listening the opportunity to hear how you respond to their questions. So I take the liberty of not mentioning the names. I hope you don't mind. So here's the first question. Thank you for the interesting and topical talk, with a smiley. Do you think social media excavated the effectiveness of right-wing populism?
What was the word, excavated or?
Exaggerated.
Exaggerated.
Exaggerated, I think, is what
absolutely. I mean, I think that there's no question, and again that it does have a great deal to do with the algorithms that social media site use to maintain people's attention. That the more that you're on the site, the more advertising they can sell, the more dollars, the greater the profit. So they want to maintain engagement. And so that process of kind of leading people down the rabbit holes of conspiracy theories is an integral part of that process. So, we saw this earlier with the radicalization of jihadis, that it's kind of open in terms of the way in which the radicalization can proceed, but that it certainly has a very powerful effect in intensifying the polarization.
Okay, thank you very much. I will read out the second question, where I must say I would like to ask the person who has sent the question to perhaps better elaborate. Is there a proper path from analysis into the battlefield of good political action? If so, please try to describe. Personally, I don't understand the question, but perhaps you can.
Well, I think what the person is asking for is what did we do about this? What is the way forward? What I've promised to talk about on Monday. So let me just say a little bit that one idea which comes very strongly out of the U.S. experience is the importance of forging something which is one might think of as comparable to the Popular Front of the 1930s and 40s, but essentially a popular front in defense of democracy, a kind of meta movement that unites people across political parties and tendencies, all of whom are essentially defending liberal democracy, the rule of law, the certain core notions of on which our parliamentary liberal democracies are based. And in the U.S., we've actually seen versions of that. There continue to this day that the never Trumpers within the Republican Party worked tirelessly in the last election to help defeat Trump. There was something called the Lincoln Project that was organized by never Trumpers that ran much better campaign advertisements than the Democrats could run themselves. And we see the same thing with the two Republicans, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who are members of the House committee that's investigating the events of January 6th. And those people are all taking the stance that here we had an attempted coup. We must get to the bottom of this. We must discover exactly what happened. We must hold people to account. We must ultimately prosecute people who were responsible for inciting the crowd. It's not sufficient that only the people who were found to be in the Capitol get arrested and tried and convicted. The ringleaders, the people who fomented the rebellion, must also be held to account. So it's a de facto popular front in defense of democracy. And that, again, this isn't a novel idea of mine. I mean, we're seeing similarly in places like Hungary and Turkey that political understandings among all of the opposition parties that they have to stand together in their effort to displace the elected authoritarian leader. So I see the creation of those kinds of popular fronts to defend democratic institutions as the first kind of critical step in the process of resisting authoritarianism, defending democracy. And then the second step that I'll talk about more on Monday is an effort to reinvigorate democracy by strengthening democratic institutions and practices at the subnational level, at the local, state, municipal level. But I'll say more about that when we read.
Thank you. So I proceed to the next question. Isn't the distinction between an inclusive and an exclusive counter movement an oversimplification? Right-wing, so exclusive counter movements might also agree to taxing the rich and curtailing the power of corporations. And many left-wing inclusive counter movements might actually not want to include right-wing supporters, for keyword cancel culture.
Well, I mean, I think that basically what we've seen in terms of the playbook of existing 21st century authoritarians is that they've worked quite diligently to bring oligarchs, those who control great wealth, to heel, to be cooperative and subservient to the regime in power. We see this with Putin, where we've seen it more recently with Xi in China, that these people must not get too big for their britches. They shouldn't think that just because they're really wealthy, they control things. But that there's essentially very little in the way of attempting to redistribute resources away from the rich. And I think the reason for that is that that these authoritarian leaders are in fact part of the rich. That they're using their conquest of state power to make themselves wealthier. We suspect that Putin himself is one of the richest people on the planet. So these authoritarian regimes tend to be kleptocracies, and so that the few exceptions are that Orban was happy to go after George Soros because he wasn't in Hungary. His institution was vulnerable. It could be kicked out of the country, but it was a symbolic attack on wealth that his local oligarchs fared much better, and he uses them to control the media and provide the kinds of messaging that he wants. Okay, so the questioner raised the woke culture issue, and yeah, obviously that both inclusion and exclusion are relative terms, and that that the movements which pursue an inclusive strategy tend to do so not with universal effectiveness. So that they might not be able or willing to include everybody. But yeah, I would still hold to the fundamental distinction that obviously political practice and theory diverge in reality.
Okay. Now here comes another question. Thanks for this fantastic talk. Some scholars argue that the crisis of liberal democracy was foreseeable due to the inherent tensions within the post-war era, the Trente Glorieuses. Do you believe that this liberal democracy, as in the post-war system, would have been sustainable if it weren't for the return of the market fundamentalist ideas through political actors such as Thatcher or Reagan?
Right. In my kind of historical understanding or recreation of the history, that the movements of the 1960s and 70s, the student movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the movements for racial inclusion, the Black Power movement, that these were movements which were pointing to the limitations of the post-World War II settlement, the limits of the New Deal in the United States, the limits of the social democratic regimes in Western Europe, and that in that kind of period of crisis from the late 60s into the late 70s, there was a possibility of a turn that would have essentially reinvigorated those models by making them more inclusive, more democratic in their foundation, exert greater control on the power of corporations and so forth. And that opening in the late 60s and early 70s was lost, that the left failed to win the day, and that was the context in which the right was able to see the same weaknesses in the post-war settlement and blow it apart by expanding the role of the market. So, I agree that that settlement, as with any settlement, I mean, that we can, the best we can hope for, is a 30, 35, 40 years of stability, and then our institutions require renewal to face kind of new economic and political realities.
Okay, I can only continue. There are quite a few questions left. Thank you for the great talk. From your perspective, whether and how do socioeconomic and cultural identity cleavages play differently in case of left and right-wing extreme leaders?
Say it once more, sir.
Yeah, so the question makes a difference between socioeconomic and cultural identity-related cleavages. And the question is whether they play out differently for left-wing and right-wing extreme leaders.
Right. Right. So I think that that I guess I would say that for the right-wing leaders, that the cultural cleavage is fundamental, and it centers around the issue of whiteness and or in some of the European instances, whiteness linked to a particular religious set of traditions. So that it comes from the logic of exclusion, that if you're going to exclude categories of people on the basis of their religion, ethnicity, that you're going to have to represent, the other ethnicity, the other religion, that it's extremely difficult to do otherwise. I think that I think that on the left, I think that the political space is kind of much more open in terms of who can emerge as leaders, and so at this current moment, when the crux of the Biden administration's political program is kind of hanging in the Congress, we have this unusual for the US situation where there are two people, one in the US House and one in the Senate, who are self-declared socialists, who are playing a key role in pushing the president's agenda through the Congress. One is Bernie Sanders, of course, in the United States Senate, and the other is this woman, Jamila Prayapal, in the House of Representatives, who's a representative from the city of Seattle in the state of Washington. And they come from completely different, ethnic backgrounds. Bernie Sanders is a Jewish man from Brooklyn. She's of Indian American heritage, I believe. So that it's possible for people from a variety of different kinds of backgrounds to play a critical role within this kinds of more inclusive political coalitions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll read out the next one. Thank you for the interesting talk. My question is, do you think that the appeal to right-wing ideologies can be somehow related to certain countries? I mean, whether certain countries tend to be inclined to certain ideologies, or is this a phenomenon that is shaped depending on the context of a time period? So it is cross-sectional between countries, or is it something related to historical time?
Well, here I go back to Polanyi, and in both the Great Transformation, and I think in the let me just talk about the Great Transformation, is that he's quite insistent that fascism should be understood as an international movement, that that there were fascist or fascist equivalent movements in almost all of the developed market economies. In many cases, they were politically marginalized and defeated, that Oswald Mosley and his British fascists were relatively easily politically isolated and defeated. In the US, his examples are the Father Townsend, the radio priest, and Huey Long's Share the Wealth movement in Louisiana, which might interfere with my claim of the difficulty of combining inclusive and exclusive. But Polanyi was insisting that fascism was international because the crisis of the global economy was an international crisis. It created parallel forms of dislocation everywhere, and people sought protection from it everywhere. And one of the forms of protection that was available in all of these different countries was a more authoritarian, a more exclusive type of option. So I would kind of hold to that line of argument that one is likely to see this phenomenon in all countries. And then the question of how strong they are they able to come to power, then can be explained by local circumstances, by historical legacies, whatever. So obviously, in the 1930s case, it wasn't accidental that that fascism came to power in countries that had been losers in the First World War. So we could use local factors to explain the relative strength or weakness of these different authoritarian movements. But again, I would emphasize their kind of global character. And, part of this is that we know that even in Scandinavia, where the kind of social democratic tradition has been strongest, these far-right anti-immigrant forces exist and have, achieved some degree of electoral success.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I would like to close the list of questions now, because we are running, or we're starting to run out of time, but I still have some, and here comes a challenge. If you can, how would you answer the title question? Why are liberal democracies in crisis, in only a few sentences? Or how would you, in short, answer this question to someone who has not researched it a lot?
So the few sentences are an extended period of austerity in which a growing where people experience both economic dislocation and a kind of zero-sum situation in terms of the distribution of status and recognition, and a feeling, a widespread feeling that political elites have become ineffective and are unable to deal with multiple challenges. That combination produces a political polarization that makes effective action even more difficult, that feeds on itself, and strengthens the weight of would-be authoritarians. I guess that's about the repetitious stuff.
Here comes something completely different. You wrote already in the 1990s on the Tea Party. What are the similarities and differences to the current dynamics on the political right in the US?
Yeah, no, that one of my kind of standard lines about American politics is that each Republican president makes you look back at the previous one, with great nostalgia, because, so when Nixon was in power, we thought he was as reactionary as humanly possible. And then Reagan came along and made Nixon look like a moderate. And, we thought that Reagan was as bad as you could get. But then we got George W. Bush, waging war in Iraq, and made us nostalgic for Reagan. And then, of course, Trump made W look like a centrist figure. So the same thing is true with these movements. The Tea Party movement now looks kind of relatively benign as compared to what's going on today. One of the things which is going on today is that local election officials are being harassed because they refuse to overturn the results of the previous election, and people call them up on the phone and said, you know, we're going to kill you and we're going to kill your children as well, and so forth. So the Tea Party was loud, and they went to town halls of Democratic congressional people, and they made a lot of noise and they disrupted, but there wasn't the tinge of violence that is now kind of running through the political system. So yes, it was a similar protective response. One of the Tea Party slogans was, you know, keep your government hands off of my Social Security, off of my Medicare, not recognizing that these were in fact government programs that, you know, that they had been persuaded that their protective institutions were under threat, but also the main issue that motivated the Tea Party that comes up in all the empirical work which was done was hostility to immigrants, a fear that immigration was changing the character of the country, that the same idea that the immigrants were coming here illegally and then they were taking resources and valuable things that should be going to citizens. So there was a similar form of exclusionary scapegoating that was driving it. But again, that since Trump's initial appearance on the stage, and you have to remember that already in the 2016 campaign, the element of violence entered the political system because Trump at his big rallies, you know, would tell the crowd to beat up the protesters. I mean, that was, you know, Trump would say from the stage, beat him up, and if there's any trouble, you know, I'll pay for your legal defense. So Trump bears a huge amount of responsibility for opening up the political system to the both the rhetoric and the practice of political violence.
Okay, there are two questions left. The first of the two is a follow-up question on the very first question that you received. Do you see a conflict between reigning in social media platforms and principles like the free speech?
Well, no, I mean, I think that obviously, you know, these issues are complicated, and lines have to be drawn and so forth. But that the basic idea is that with traditional media, that editors bore some responsibility for what was being said in the pages of the newspaper or the magazine or whatever, and that they could be held to some account for provoking violence or similar things. That the problem is that sites like Facebook bear no responsibility. They can post the most incendiary thing, and there's no way to hold the site responsible for that. And that's where I think the problem lies, that we all know that that free speech rights are not unlimited, that various formulations which provoke violence need to be restricted and limited. And so it seems to me there are solutions to the problem which preserve the space of freedom without without allowing certain kinds of violent rhetoric that leads to the intimidation of political opponents.
Okay, thank you. Now I've spared one question for the final end, for the very end, because I like that question very much. Thank you for your speech. Do you think it will be possible in the near future to change the economy-based European Union into a much more socially based European Union? What has to happen in the near future? What is your opinion on this, please?
Well, I do believe that this is part of the shift that has to happen in order to protect the democratic character of the European state. So I envision an end to the regime of austerity, an end to the Maastricht limitation on deficits, and a kind of new envisioning of where the European community is, rather than discouraging, is encouraging governments to be responsive to the needs of their citizenry and have more resources by which to respond. And I saw the agreement around the COVID crisis of some degree of Europeanized debt as a small step in that direction. But I think that a big part of the issue is that I see the kind of character of the European community, and even the kind of defects of Maastricht and so forth, as part of an effort to protect Europe from the kind of instability of the dollar-based international monetary system, and the kind of refusal of the US to limit its own balance of payments deficits, adhere to some kind of strategy of stability. So I see the need for say, another Bretton Woods, a new convening that changes the architecture of the international monetary system, that moves it back towards a regime of stable exchange rates, that reduces the magnitude of the global capital movements. I see that as a kind of necessary step in order to facilitate a different kind of politics within the European community. And obviously, none of that is in immediate sight. So I kind of imagine a a multi-level political game in which there's campaigns for different politics at the national level, campaigns to change the character of the European community, and campaigns to alter the rules of the game of the international economic order, that those would have to move forward together, and that there would be some kind of synergy that would strengthen each movement reciprocally.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Well, we are reaching the end of our meeting. So let me start my final words by saying, Fred, thank you very much for this really fascinating talk. And I noticed that almost all people who have been here at the outset are still with us in the audience. So you did not lose many people, hardly any, which indicates that this talk was felt as being fascinating. Also, the number of questions that you received is a hint that you made a great talk. Thank you very much for this. Well, we have gotten used to this kind of virtual meetings. In real life, I would now have had the opportunity of inviting you and the audience to a buffet, which would be right next door. And we would have the opportunity to have a drink together and to continue discussing, to dig deeper in some of the topics and to socialize a bit. I must say I really missed that part of this kind of events. Nevertheless, thank you all for having been here, having stayed tuned, and I think, Fred, you have made us a very interesting evening. It was worth being here, I'm sure. So thank you very much. Thank you all, and we will close the session